Everyone, just checking my sound. Okay, hi Jacob. Bear with me today. I'm working from the East Coast and just have my small laptop and not my big screen, so it might be interesting maneuvering between things. So I will do my best. Unfortunately, we have the heat here also, but with a lot of humidity. So I wish I was back in Montana with the dry heat right now. I think it's 1:31. So I think just to honor everyone's time, and I have a feeling we're going to have a rich discussion. I think we should get started. Jacob, does that sound good to you?
Sounds great, Crystal. Ready to go.
Okie doke. So today we're going to look at a couple things before we begin, and then Jacob will review our norms just in case there is anyone new, and then we will go to our subcommittee and hopefully come to consensus with the counselor to administrator pathway, and then really dive into our reciprocity discussion. So first, I just wanted to give an update. I was asked to let you know that the OPI has been in the process of getting our website changed to a different platform for a while now. And we've, of course, with technology, have run into a lot of bumps with that and it hasn't gone all the way through yet. So there has not been pages built for the chapters for chapter 57 or 58, which we were supposed to do because of that. So we've been putting the webinar links right on the front page of the OPI site along with the agendas for now. And once things can be put into the new format, then we will have the sites. But I was told to just let you know that we're doing the best we can with what we have. And if there's any information that you're looking for or you know somebody looking for, please just let us know. And then to look at our timeline. So to ensure we have a steady timeline for our work, we for our first round of recommendations, we need to be done by August 6th to have ready for the superintendent so that we can meet the deadline for the September Board of Public Ed meeting. And I just put the next two. Obviously, we're not putting anything in front of the board next week because they're meeting for July. So the next meeting would be September 16th, 17th, and then after that would be November 4th and 5th. And I think for clarification, how I am understanding this is whatever we have ready to present is what, obviously we're not expected to have everything done by that August 6th deadline, but, hopefully the counselor piece and fingers crossed the reciprocity, maybe we have ready for that. And we can go get that to the superintendent. Go ahead, McCall.
Thanks, Crystal. Just a logistics question.
Sure.
So it sounds like you guys might be trying to do these in rounds. Wondering what would happen if this task force determined that they wanted to look at a rule, an administrative rule that already had been presented to the board? Would we go back and look at that again at a different time, or what? I guess I'm just wondering if you guys have thought about that, because that's something that I'm just curious about how we would do that at the board level.
That's a good question. I mean, it is my understanding that we are to do it in rounds as we have recommendations to present to the superintendent. But I'm understanding, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that if we, bring a suggestion and then it maybe implement, or, it has an effect on a different arm, that then we'd have to look at that and it wouldn't be ready. Is that what you're saying?
That potentially, but also we're like right now looking at the school counselor pathway, right? So we're looking at all these different arms. But what if we determine that we want to also come at it at a different angle and look at it for a different reason as it relates to something else? But we're looking at some of the same arms. So we've already presented a handful of arms to the Board of Public Ed, but some of those arms actually might be part of a later recommendation as well. I mean, are you going to ask the board then to look at the same arm multiple times and change it? And how would then the Secretary of State's office know as we're looking at the same arms in different waves? So I'm just thinking about logistically what that might look like for the board and how it may be somewhat confusing.
I understand. I don't have an answer for you, unfortunately. I am just relaying the information that I have. I can definitely look into that and get information before the next meeting. Since we're not meeting next week, I can, try to find out and get some of those answers. And
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thanks.
Sure.
Crystal,
Anyone else? Go ahead. Yeah.
well, one thing to consider, Crystal, and as we ask these questions, and McCall too, for the group to consider, based upon what I heard this morning, that was new information to me. There is the possibility that the group could just present sort of larger areas where they'd like to see changes and not necessarily specific changes to arms. And so that could be a way to present the first round too, is just say we really want to see some adjustments in these areas, with the caveat that as we go forward, we're looking to see where specific arm language adjustments could be made as well. So Crystal, that could be something to ask if that's an appropriate technique to kind of do, is maybe keep the buckets big at first and then think about specifics as we move on.
That's really interesting, Jacob. And actually, I think it might be interesting too if there's actually a few members, former members of the Board of Public Ed on here. So it might be interesting to hear from them, if we have the time, of course, but maybe what that process in the past has looked like and if they've ever approached the rule revisions in that type of way.
I think if there's anybody willing to share, that would be very useful at this point and a good use of time.
I agree.
I would. This is Sharon Carroll.
Go ahead, Sharon.
I would agree that having this task force make general recommendations would be most well suited for someone else to perhaps fine tune what the ARM says itself, or we are faced with a constant reopening of Chapter 57. I'm not really sure it was the intent of the OPI to have us necessarily propose actual language in ARM, but instead a general consensus about certain parts of that. Diane, does that is that commensurate with what your experience was? Unmute. There you go.
That does sound like what we've done in the past. I don't remember waves of changes to the same ARM coming through. I think it was done with a little more finite. I think there might have been some specific changes to ARM, and Angela may chime in too. But I think it would be simpler if we either had all the changes to a specific, section ARM regulation rather than going back and back and back and back. So if we could decide what we're going to do for counselors, or this sounds more complicated than it's been done in the past. And maybe there's a better solution that we might try. What do you think, Angela?
Thanks, Diane. I appreciate that. I guess I stepped into this believing it was a comprehensive overview and review of Chapter 57. And I would offer to that it seems that the changes or the recommendations to change Chapter 57 ought to be comprehensive as well. And by that, I mean that they ought to come together so that they can be viewed and considered, and folks can come to the table and weigh in on them together, because there is, as we have found just with our look at the Class 6 license and the pathway from the Class 6 to the Class 3, implications for various pieces and parts of Chapter 57 to be impacted. And those are ones that we have talked about already before any recommendations have moved forward. We can't anticipate how some of the discussions we will have this week, next week, and the weeks down the road might impact, how those might impact some of the conversations or recommendations that we would have made before we actually come to the table to talk about all of the chapter as a whole. So I guess I would just offer that it seems to make sense for me that all of the changes would come to the Board of Public Education to be considered as a whole, and then to be weighed in by the public, weighed in on by the public as a whole would make sense as well. Just because I think that there's so many pieces and parts of this chapter that impact other pieces and parts of the chapter that we need to consider.
So Angela, in sum, I hear you saying you're in favor of not having rounds of recommendations, but everything coming at one time.
I think that's really important, Jacob, that it comes at once so that it can be considered wholly, because I do think that there's parts of Chapter 57 that we haven't discussed yet, or that we might discuss today before things move forward, and then have to go back and make adjustments to. And I just think that that's a really difficult path for the public to follow. I think it's going to be a challenging path for the Board of Public Ed to follow, but if we make all of our recommendations, I think they can see them and consider them wholly rather than in part, in pieces.
Jacob, this is Sharon Carroll. I agree with that. Even as the subcommittee work that we did, it was just very difficult just to simply narrow it down to only counselor when there seemed to be some other avenues, even within those same 3 lines that other groups have been working on. I think that what we need to do is to consider that if we really are looking at Chapter 57, then we're looking at Chapter 57 as a whole. It is very difficult just to look at the counselor piece without revising some other language that we didn't intend to change necessarily. So I think that when we were all selected for this chapter, we thought it was an overarching Chapter 57 review.
I don't disagree with anything you said, Sharon. And I think as we move into our reciprocity discussion, speak up, but I feel like we'll have sort of broader topics that will allow us to look across the chapter and not narrow in on one specific sort of thing as we have done to this point. That will be more holistic and allowing recommendations. And just so to be transparent, this ties into this conversation as to what we present, but I envision the process, being that we sort of talk in a holistic general terms, what do we think we need to adjust? And then we make a decision as to, well, these are what we need to change. Where within the chapter do we think we might need to go and make these adjustments? And whether or not we want to do that. So Sharon, that's back to your original point as to, do we then just present from this group? We think there needs to be changes to sort of, just for an example, if it's out of state teachers, we need to offer full reciprocity. And then is that the recommendation we put forth, or is it that we actually go into the chapter and present language? And I think that's a secondary decision to make once we have this next discussion, which is how we're going to operate moving forward unless we're told different.
We have Tracy Mosman here. Do you have anything to add, Tracy, with this discussion?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. I think this is a great conversation. Certainly having been part of rule revisions in the past, I think what you're all talking about is historically how this has occurred. And so, Crystal, I wonder, after we get through with the conversation today, as you said, we'll have a little bit of time to circle back. I think just bringing Cheryl back into the conversation, and McCall, maybe connecting with you, because I wonder if the intention could be that they want to just keep this on the board agenda for updates about where the committee is at with the process, or if really what they're looking at is, so is it an informational item to update on the status of the group, or is the intention or the ask really about putting forth items that will go through and be up for decision making, because I think those are two very different presentations that would go before the board. So I think we can seek some clarification on that.
Thank you, Tracy. Can you circle back and just clarify, whenever you said the way we're talking about it is a way it's been done before, what is that way specifically, just to make sure? Because like the broader recommendations are the specific recommendations, I guess, is that what?
My recollection is that there has been a specific set of language revisions that have come to the board for the overall chapter as the group has discussed. So all of chapter 57, because I think the conversation that folks are having it is very important, because a change you might make to one subsection could have implications for another subsection. And it's really hard to look at those in isolation without being an overall package for the board to consider. And so my recollection was always that there was a series of 3 board meetings in which the recommendation was brought forward. And then there was a second reading and then a vote at the 3rd board meeting of the overall chapter. And that was my understanding of how the process was done historically.
Have you ever seen a mix of the two? So I'll go back to my example of like full reciprocity, that there's not, that could require sort of a, maybe require a change that would be very large. Has there ever been a mix of like, we think these specific language changes need to take place, but then we also think there needs to be some rules around this change that doesn't exist, or something like that, if that was to come up? Does that make sense, or is that too muddy of a?
I would defer to Diane and Sharon, but my understanding has always been that so for example, if we take the example of reciprocity, nowhere in chapter 57 is that word actually used throughout chapter 57, although there's some implications for what reciprocity means when we start talking about out-of-state licenses. And so if the committee so chooses to add language specifically around reciprocity, that would be a new section really that would need to be added. And so I think that further highlights why some folks are feeling like this needs to be looked at in its entirety, because the group may come up with topics or sections that they want to add or completely strike from chapter 57. And that only makes sense in the context of looking at the whole chapter together. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. That adds clarity for me.
This is Sharon Carroll. That is indeed what has happened in the past. The task force has often met for up to 2 years, because the process that you're describing is quite lengthy, where some overarching general ideas are reached in agreement, and then the process of language change comes about. That's presented to the superintendent's office, and the superintendent's office then, in good faith, makes that recommendation to the Board of Public Ed. The recommendation actually comes from the task force to the superintendent. The superintendent makes a recommendation to the Board of Public Ed.
And I would just add that the recommendation is very fine-tuned, language is very specific at that point, and the public is given time to weigh in on just exactly what those changes would look like.
I'm going to add one more thing, and that would be that CISPAC. I'm sorry, Angela. Please. I cut in on you and I apologize, Angela. All I was saying is CISPAC often has an opportunity to review as well. So one more wrinkle. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No worries, Diane. I think Angela was going to say the same thing potentially, but she is muted, and so thank you for that input. And thank you, Tracy. I know that adds clarity for me as we move forward. I hope that that does for the task force members, maybe anybody who hasn't been a part of the task force or been on the state board as a state board member before. And if questions come up, we encourage you to send those to us as well, so that we can seek clarity and ensure that you as members of this task force have a clear understanding of what the task is at hand as well. It could be that Crystal and I also need those questions answered, and your questions may spur something within us to help provide clarity.
I agree. And I think that we have some answers to get, and then we will get back to the group. Tracy definitely helped me understand since this is my first experience, but we will, I think if it's okay, we can move forward and we will get some answers for the group and get back to you.
Hey everybody, just if anybody's new, just real quick, we're welcome. Please use the chat if you've got questions. We're monitoring that. We talked last week about the hand raise function. That is mostly for Crystal and myself to just let us know that you have something you want to say, and to limit to the greatest extent us talking over each other, which is certainly hard to avoid in the Zoom setting, as it's hard to monitor the body language and of your colleagues as we're working. So the hand raise feature helps add some structure to that. So if you do want to speak, try to use the hand raise to the greatest extent possible. We'll get to you. And if by chance you have your hand up and we missed your turn because someone was in the flow of a conversation, jumped in, know that we'll get back to you. It wasn't on purpose that we skipped over you. We will come back. We ask that you stay muted. And then as we go through, we just repeat again, be respectful, be supportive, be present, and be open. That's for all of us, Crystal and ourselves. We need your support as we move through this and help us understand exactly because we want to end up with something that is the benefit for our students and our educators in the state. So thank you for your participation. If you are new, this is a key piece to help us move forward, because again, as we work in a task force, we're here because we have diverse perspectives and diverse ideas. And I love to say that a productive conversation may not be comfortable, because if it's comfortable, that really means everybody's agreeing and you're not making any progress towards improving anything. So there may be a point where we don't have 100% agreement on something and we need to come to a decision that allows the group to move forward. We decided in our very first meeting that that'll be a consensus of a supermajority of greater than 60%. We hope to finalize some language today specific to the counselor rules that our group has been working on, and we should be able to tell when we get to that point. It'll be clear as we have the process, but we may need to vote, and if we do, we'll be looking for a majority of greater than 60%. And with that, I think we can dig into our the work that we've done on the specific Class 3 administrative license 417, specific to the path for a counselor to earn that. I think our opening discussion let us know that this may not be the last time we see this, but we certainly are focused on the counselor piece of this today and a potential adjustment that can happen there. So if you go on to the next slide, McCall, I'll let you jump in, but I think we've highlighted the most recent adjustment here. Is there anything from the group who'd like to speak? I said, McCall, you don't have to do it. I don't put you on the spot, to sort of just explain the thinking over the past week and the adjustment that's been made.
Yeah, Jacob, I will make one quick mention of one of the changes that we had talked about last week was that change from the three credits in each of the following: Montana School Law, Finance, and Collective Bargaining, changing that to Montana Educator Prep Programs. So it's my understanding that that's actually part of a separate revision, still part of these arms, but not part of the counselor pathway. What that piece does is it basically just says part of the Montana Educator Prep Programs, because not always is that 3 credits. Sometimes that may be less. So that's why that changes there. It's not relevant to this pathway that we're talking about right now, but still relevant to the arm. So I've removed it for this conversation because we are talking about the pathway. And of course you have 417 here. There are a slew of other arms that need to be discussed as well when it comes to these small specific changes. But we did make lots of changes from the last time we talked last week. So I'll let others chat and jump in right now.
Sharon, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. McCall and I and the rest of the subcommittee members did go back and forth in quite what I would call quite spirited discussion. It was a good discussion. I did end up, I began by proposing of teaching or school counseling experience, just to put it on the table. I'm going to have to say that as a long time, 25-year classroom teacher, I submitted this particular language with reservation. I really have a hard time with a person in a leadership position having no teaching experience whatsoever, one that is actually involved in evaluating other teachers. However, and I know there's been the contention that, of course, as a school counselor, you have teaching experience, but to be able to have a form where you actually credit those 3 years of teaching experience, what gets back to then what does 1 year of teaching experience actually mean? As a teacher, then, as a teacher, we believe, of course, that we've got we assign grades, we do assessments, we hold parent-teacher conferences, and I think it's that what we ended up hinging on was, well, is those teaching experience include assigning grades or not? And it's just too muddy, I think, to have us go about a form to complete about whether or not that particular school counselor had in classroom teaching experience. So I actually proposed that or school counseling experience line with some reservations, knowing that we would have a good discussion. On that other part of McCall's discussion about, there apparently is some work going on there about the 3 semester credits of college courses. And I know that we're trying to limit ourselves to counselor pathway, and that is really important at this point. But if this is a Chapter 57 task force, and there are some other discussions going around about Chapter 57, I guess I would propose to the group that if there's other discussions going on about that, perhaps it would be good as soon as possible to include us in what's going on there, because our group ended up actually, and I probably initiated that by asking, so if you're not in a Montana university system and you came to us with school counseling experience with a standard teaching license, then what if your next pathway was out of state and not in state? So of course we know that the Board of Public Ed governs teacher preparation programs in Montana, but they don't govern those outside of Montana. So as the group discussed back and forth on that document, again, there was a lively discussion about what does it mean to complete a teacher preparation program, getting this K-12 principal endorsement, if in fact you choose to do that not in the MUS. So thank you, and I know there's more good discussion going on there. I'll mute myself now.
It's like calling in one of those sports shows. You're just going to hang up and listen. I am not aware of any other conversations around 57 that are occurring that are not occurring within this group. That said, I also agree, based upon our opening conversation, that if we have comments within the group about the principal endorsement in general while we're staring at it, we might as well have those conversations now too, versus coming back. So Jewel, I'm going to come to you in just a second, but I want to ask the group, looking here at this inclusion of 3 years of teaching or school counseling, let's just ask about that right now. Does anybody have any comments about that specific? And then I'm going to open it up a little bit broader. Really just C. If that language was added in there on C, is that thoughts about that, just at the basic level? All right, Nick, I'm going to come to you after Jewel. So go ahead, Jewel, and then we'll get to Nick.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Jacob. In regard to Sharon's question, there was a Chapter 57 feedback group, and there is a summary. So there are other groups having discussions about Chapter 57. I'm not sure if that's what Sharon was referring to. And they met June 21st at 10:30 a.m. So I'm not sure what their purpose is, but they are.
I will add my understanding of their purpose. Tracy, Crystal, if Tracy, if you're still here, the feedback group is consisted of people who applied to be on the task force and were not selected. So the feedback group gives them a forum to give feedback that this task force can take into account. But they're not having discussions. They're not having discussions about actual recommendations, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So they're giving us sort of a public input piece to give us information, but not the work of a task force itself.
And that's Jacob, that's how I understand it as well. You were, I think, at that meeting. I was not able to attend, but it is just another group, like you said, that wanted to be part of the task force. It's that second layer where we present to them what the task force is discussing or recommending, and then they give their input that we then would bring back to the task force. So it is not new information or new areas of Chapter 57 being presented.
Thank you.
I think Nick was next, right, Jacob?
Yeah, Nick was, but he put his hand down. Nick, did you have something to say?
Yeah, thank you. Right now we're looking at licensure, and licensure, there's been some concerns that have been brought up over the last couple of weeks about having a non-teaching counselor that is eligible for a principal's endorsement. But licensure doesn't necessarily mean they get the job. We still have several layers of local control that need to hire these individuals with no teaching experience to run their elementary or high school or their building level administrator job. So I guess I feel more comfortable knowing that that these individuals, should they be hired to run a school, that they are hired with the understanding that they've never done the teaching end of the job. So I think that's a check to our balances that even if they have the endorsement or the license, doesn't necessarily mean that that they can be hired to do the job. So just a thought there.
Thank you, Nick. Sue, you had your hand up next. Sue, are you with us? Sue Corrigan?
Oh, sorry. I was talking to myself there for a second. Anyway, I just wanted to echo what Nick had just said. That was the comment I wanted to bring up. As a school board member, I'm very concerned that we maintain some flexibility in our local control in who we hire. I feel like by adding, or school counseling in there still allows that flexibility. In fact, if you have some fabulous person, who's a counselor that could move up, I would hate to put more roadblocks in their way. So I believe that adding that wording there, although at first I was a little uncomfortable with it, but after thinking about it, I think it maintains that flexibility that is needed for local control.
Thank you, Sue. Diane, and then Angela will come to you.
My points would be similar to what Sharon said. I have some reservations. However, I know this was vetted by a wide-ranging group in the past. And I also know of the difficulties there would be in administration, as Sharon referenced, if we're so specific about, well, this will work, and if they can check this box, and they could do this if they check that box. I'm thinking about the OPI staff and trying to work through the implementation of a real complicated scenario, and I see those things as more problems than they might be worth. So generally, I can see supporting this.
Thank you, Diane. Angela?
We support this. This, is the members of the group know, was a recommendation made by folks within the Montana University system. And then I just want to speak to what I think may be some of the conversation around the course language. And there is a recommendation out there from one of our subcommittees, the licensure subcommittee, that was presented to the superintendent around, excuse me, modifying the academic requirements for out-of-state educational leaders seeking licensure into Montana, and basically moving to excuse me, moving to move the 3 required courses to 2 required courses. And so that's something that we can discuss later, but it's not necessarily specific to what you see in D. It's around finance law, collective bargaining, excuse me.
Angela, that is from the OCHI licensure group that put together the recommendations and presented those to the superintendent. Are those published publicly somewhere for the group to look at?
We sent them to the superintendent's office in a number of months ago, but I can see about getting them over to you.
Yes, thank you. I am certain that Angela, you could share them with the group. Crystal, maybe we could investigate to see if it's something we could also put up on the our Google site within the resources as well.
Sounds good.
Sharon, go ahead.
Thank you for those efforts that are going forth towards getting that document in front of all of us. I think that then we'll be able to have all the information in front of us for all the recommendations. Thank you.
Any other comments specifically about this school counseling edition? Having some comments in the chat if people are monitoring that. Tina added some context about the extent of the experiences that many school counselors do have that would be relevant to administration. Oh, can we go back? Crystal. So as we think about this at this point, I want to be efficient in this conversation, meaning I don't want to dwell on it right now, but I would want to hear some thoughts from the group about, are there other areas in this Class 3 administrative license that you think we need to tackle? And when I say that, we're not going to tackle them right now, but we're going to add them to our bucket of conversation topics. And that is simply because I do want to get into our reciprocity conversation today, and that's going to take some time. And I think that reciprocity conversation may also lead us back to this at some point. But just while we're here, what are some areas that we think we might want to look at, Sharon?
Yes, D.
D, and specifically the idea of what? Anything?
Right, whether 3 semester credits are necessary or whether it's just completing a system of requirements. But I've actually heard from several folks entering in from out of state that are not encouraged, but required to take these 3 semester courses in Montana school law, that much of the conversation, the bulk of the course is in special education law, and they've already had all of that, but because those are federal rules. And there's been way less training that they thought there would be in Montana administrative rule and collective bargaining law. Just throwing that out there.
Thank you, Sharon.
Mm-hmm.
Angela, did you want to say something? I felt like you, okay. Any other comments about this before we do move on to the? Okay, so I think we'll move on. It seems like there's some hesitancy, but no one is opposed to adding a school counseling piece in at this point. So that's something we could put forward as a recommendation. Okay, Crystal, next slide. So here we see our cascading impact. And so as we think about the 413 language, the general language around the Class 3 administrative license, to stay in alignment, there's addition to number 3 of a teaching license, because it used to just say license, teaching license, and then the Class 6 counseling licensing languages as well, which would be in line with the previous revision. Any quick comments on this? Okay, next slide, Crystal. And then again, the superintendent's endorsement, which is different than the, separate of the administrative license itself, is the superintendent's endorsement. You need 3 years experience as an appropriate licensed teacher or a school counselor. Again, that stays in place. Does this add any adjustments? Any other conversations about adding that language for consistency? Does it being the endorsement require any further discussion? And of course, as you read it, you would still you'd have to get your administrative license and then serve at least 1 year as a principal. Okay, thank you for the group and looking at that. Next slide, Crystal. Here we are again. We see elementary principal endorsement and secondary principal endorsement. It's a simple addition of that school counseling language to be consistent. Okay, excellent. Thank you to the subgroup for all the work that you guys did. I, again, was on many of the emails. I could see the work that was going on. I know it was productive and good discussion that most likely will be very useful as we move forward too in other areas. So Crystal, our next slide then, just everything we looked at, sort of your last chance to speak up in opposition to anything. If the addition of that school counselor piece is something that we could write down in our notes as this group would like to see as a recommendation. Okay, thank you for that, Sharon, go ahead.
How do you want us to vote here? Are we?
Again, if no one spoke up, I think we have a consensus based upon how I judge the conversation as we went through that. It's not necessary to take a formal vote at this point. We're good to go. So now reciprocity. This is going to be even more exciting. Last week, we just briefly got into this, and we certainly recommended, and if you haven't had a chance, or if were unable to attend last week, there is a report that is available on our Google site that is an overview of reciprocity sort of in Montana in the past, as well as a snapshot of policies and practice across the United States. Key points to think about in terms of kind of the historical nature, there used to be more flexibility and reciprocity within Montana, with some interstate agreements for full reciprocity with 3 states, Idaho, South Dakota, and Utah. Those agreements went away in 2002, and no agreement since that time have been pursued. Next slide. And we came to some general conclusions in the report, and I say we, that the report was completed by the Region 17 Comprehensive Center, my colleague Eric, who's with us, and Jacqueline Raphael, that there are potentially some licensure requirements currently within the ARM that could deter individuals from pursuing licenses. So what that means is if we look at applications, we also have to consider the idea that it may not be a full representation of what's occurring, because there could be some people who do not bother to apply because they read the ARMs and recognize that they would not be accepted, even though their credentials may be accepted in other states. And then Crystal, you added a little bit more data here, I think, around the emergency authorizations. Can you expand on that?
Sure. I think the question last week we had was if we had any data surrounding how many were out-of-state applicants that received the emergency authorization. And although we had 118 issued last year, the data that I could find was only out of 68. So it may not have been from the full year. I'm thinking maybe it was half the year. I didn't have a year with it, but there was 16 applicants out of 68 that were out of state. And that was the only data that I could find to give us a little bit of background.
And Mike asked a question, which someone on the panel may know with some archival knowledge. Was anybody a part of, or does anybody have any context as to any discussion or reasons that may have informed the decision in 2002 to revoke the interstate agreements or not renew them? Do we have anybody who has any of that knowledge with us? Diane? You're muted, Diane.
It's been so long that my memory is not as clear. I recall some general discussions about quality issues and concerns with preparation standards and licensure standards being more lax. So those are my vague recollections, but I think we'd have to go back into the records to have a real accurate rendition of what happened and why.
Thank you, Diane.
So Jacob, and I'm a big fan of Eric's work, and it's good to see him on the call. I read through the report, and I guess my question is, because I read the anecdote, the stories that you provide, the sample cases, I guess my question is, do we know how many folks from out of state on average apply for licensure and don't pursue it, or do pursue it? Do we know really if what we're reading here in these sample cases are the exception and not the rule? So I guess what I'm trying to assess is here, do we really have an issue that needs to be addressed in regards to reciprocity?
Yeah, I think for the purposes of the report, those were mostly illustrative cases just to highlight areas where out-of-state applicants may encounter friction. And they're stories that came to us in conversation with OPI staff and leadership. In terms of how many people are actually impacted or affected by this, I think we would never really know for sure. As Jacob said, we'll never know who kind of looked at it and said, that's not going to work. I'm not even going to try. OPI may have some data they could possibly pull from licensure, but my understanding was it may not be an easily harvested number, but Crystal might know more of what the licensing technicians could pull from the database.
Well, we actually can't pull anything out of the MSIS database. We're in the process of an RFP and trying to get a new system. So that is one of the reasons why. But I can tell you, and it's not data driven, but that since I started in April, the number of people that are asking questions in regards to getting licensure from out of state is overwhelming. The questions about, the praxis, how many years experience that is needed, we're getting the same questions over and over again. And without it being, again, data driven, I have asked the specialists, do you feel that there has been an influx? And they said absolutely, that out of state applicants have increased significantly. So I understand we want it to be a little bit more definitive and a little bit more just with data behind it. And I think we might be able to try and find some piece of that for you, Angela, but I can tell you just in conversation that it definitely has been an issue that I have seen in the few short months that I've been in this role.
Thank you.
Anyone else with additional context? Again, we're speaking anecdotally, but Tracy?
And I think we're going to go back and look because Julie Mergel did a presentation to the board on some of these this research that was done through the research and review phase. And so I think there's some data in there that may help further drill down on this question. I do know that one of the pieces that that was addressed from the out-of-state perspective was that years of experience, and that candidates, when we looked at the number of applicants coming into MSIS and the reasons for denial letters that were being sent, there were candidates who didn't have that 5 years of experience. And so they were choosing to stay in another state and continue to teach because they didn't have that 5 years of experience and didn't want to go back to school.
Let's move on to the next slide, Crystal. Thank you, Tina, for your comment. So in the report, some specific revisions that, well, Crystal, I'm speaking out of turn here. These did not exactly come from the report, did they? These came from.
This came from the report.
Okay, these did come from the report. All right, so possible areas for revision that the research may have pointed to was to look at the recency requirements and offer test out options in lieu of additional coursework. Again, potentially review the required years of experience that we just discussed and refine required evidence of effectiveness. Expand licensure eligibility for candidates with advanced credentials. Treat traditional and alternative educator preparation more equally for licensure purposes. Revise and allow more flexibility within licensure endorsements areas, and examine the use of emergency authorizations of employment and consider ways to move towards licensure. So that will be in table 3, which we recommend, if you're in the report, provides the best summary of what was found. And that I want to be clear in that this was a comparison of Montana current ARM rules that exist in other states and areas where there was some differentiation and flexibility may exist if this group wished to consider those areas. The report should not be interpreted as recommendations, but simply areas for thought. versus thinking about specific revisions. There are areas where there could be some possibility for the group to consider adjustments. Eric?
Tina has a great point in the comment on the importance of that experience. I think that's very powerful, what she writes there. Additionally, I guess I would offer to the committee this. The Department of Labor and Industry of Montana has reported that the Montana Educator Prep programs are producing enough completers at elementary, middle, and high school levels in all but just a few content areas. So our EPPs are graduating enough completers. So I guess what I would offer to the committee is this. As we talk about reciprocity, maybe put that off to the side for a little bit and maybe consider with Chapter 57 how we can, through administrative rule, best support completers to those geographic areas and to those high content areas. And I don't know if there is a solution within 57 or if there are opportunities at a solution in 57. But if we're going to look at reciprocity, folks coming in from out of state, let's take a look at the knowledge that we have in knowing that our EPPs are graduating completers in our state who may need help in getting to the places where they are needed and the districts that need them, rather than maybe take a look at this first. That's just something that I wanted to put out there and I was thinking about as I was reading the reciprocity report.
Sean, you have your hand up?
Yeah. Question to Angela is how many of those completers are going out of state? So although we have a lot of completers coming out of the university system, how many are leaving? For instance, all of my family who have been who have completed their educational programs in Montana have gone out of state. So I was just curious about that. That leads to the point about, do we have enough teachers actually that are completers in the Montana university system staying in state?
You know, the data that we've taken a look at does show that the folks who come to us from out of state will more often than not return to out of state to take their place of employment. What is also of concern, Sean, is that we're graduating completers who choose not to go into the profession. However, we still believe that we have a pipeline in Montana and that our EPPs are doing great work recruiting soon to be teachers, soon to be school leaders, and that we need to do a better job at distributing them where they are needed.
Go ahead, Sean. Did you have something else?
I just wanted to follow up. Okay, so to clarify, my family members have gone to Montana schools and gone out of state. From a school board position, and then especially the administrators that I've spoken to, the K-8, specifically K-8 administrator, that particular administrator speaks specifically to having or seeing interest from out of state teachers, but the requirements are so onerous that they just give up looking for employment or teaching within the state. And again, maybe there's no answer, maybe there is. I just wanted to clarify the one point and make the other from a board trustee position.
Thank you, Sean. Christine?
As a K-8 superintendent, I would definitely support that thought. It is very difficult, and I'm over here in the northeast corner where salaries make a difference, right next to North Dakota. And there's just so many things that play into it. Location. So then when you add a whole list of, 2 or 3 summers worth of courses for out-of-staters, they don't want to come.
Sean?
Yeah, I appreciate the completer data, but from the perspective where I'm at, and speaking directly to K-8 and high school administrators, I'm not saying the same thing that we have, and I don't know how to say this exactly, but we don't have, we may have completers within the state, but I'm not sure that they're actually staying here because we're having a hard time getting them. Salaries are issues and so on and so forth. I just wanted to go ahead and add that into that conversation. So thank, and any clarification or any points or any corrections are much appreciated.
Thank you, Sean. John?
Thanks. The first time you called on Sean, I didn't have my hand up and I thought you said John, and I thought, did I want to say something? And so I was thinking for a moment, and I think I might want to say something. So we have some good possible revisions here. I still don't, we're not really hearing what the crux of the problem is. And so trying to talk about these specific revisions without really understanding the exact problem we're trying to fix, are we just going to create another problem in another area? And to Sean's point, we do have a lot of students who graduate and go elsewhere. Part of the reason they leave is they don't know all the great places there are to teach in Montana. And, we've had some pretty good luck with some of our recent graduates, and we've sent people to Christine, and Christine, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think you've kept at least one of those folks that came up to student teach with you. And we're really trying hard to get them to go out and see there's more to Montana than just where their school is located, whether that's Dillon or Bozeman or where have you. And trying to get students really to the places where they're needed is challenging, and it's not just the things on this list. And I would echo what some of the other folks were saying about salaries and benefits, and different pieces all play into that. But even just getting our folks off of our campuses out to those rural districts is an important first step to really getting them to see where those jobs are. There's real kids there that need great teachers. Those communities are welcoming and supportive of their educators. We take students out to a lot of different small towns with our book club, tech club. They go out to Broadus. We've run rural practicums where we take candidates in their semester right before student teaching, and we have hit the northeast corner of the state, Shelby, Sydney and around Sydney. And then we've gone over to kind of the more north central part of the state with Cut Bank and Shelby. We've done a lot of work around the Lewistown area, going out to Roy and Grass Range and other places. So trying to get students really to envision, not just talking about where jobs are, but seeing those communities and getting into them. And we've had some good luck. We've had some students from places like Cleveland, Ohio that come out to one of those experiences and say, wow, I really didn't realize that this is what people meant when they said rural Montana, and I can work on this. We've done some rural colloquiums and things where we've had the superintendents come in and talk to them, and many people on this call have been here and experienced working with the students in that type of a manner. There is a lot of data that shows that we create or generate a large licensed population in many licensure areas. There are licensure areas that we don't produce enough in. And those are areas that I think we really should look at. Special education, the sciences, math to some degree. But again, I think when I look at these specific reservation or revision suggestions, I really want to understand what's deterring those out-of-state folks. What is their roadblock? And then how do we help with that roadblock specifically to get them in?
Tracy?
I think that's a great question. And I think not that it's going to be necessarily hard data, but there was some research that was done during the research and review phase. We sent a survey out actually we had, I think, 600 applicants in the MSIS system that had started their application towards licensure, but had not yet completed. And so we wanted to understand why they were pending, why they were sitting in the queue and hadn't yet been approved. And that those research findings are available, and that might be something, Jacob and Crystal, if you haven't shared with this group, that they might be interested in seeing, because I know there were, certainly issues around just the usage of MSIS and the barriers of that old technology that were a hindrance for some applicants, but they definitely identified some themes and some trends in there that might be just helpful for this group to take a look at, to see from the applicant's perspective, trying to apply towards licensure in Montana, what some of those barriers were from their perspective.
Sean with an S.
Yes, and to the to that point, I think that what I'm thinking of is what are the reasons? Why are we looking at this, and what's the reason? And speaking to that point, yeah, we have a lot of graduates and completers and so on and so forth. But I think we need to create more flexibility, for those from out of state who can contribute to education in Montana. Again, as the point, speaking back toward the principal kind of discussion, I'm not sure that the conversation needs to necessarily about being hired, but that they have the opportunity to be hired, and that we remove as many barriers as possible, so we can try to get the best applicants, the best teachers in our schools from wherever they may come from. So I think that's the reason, that's the role, or as we think about specific revisions from this research, I think that's what we're looking at, in my mind at least.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think that that's really important. And I think, those of you from a small, very rural and remote district would also appreciate, I think, the importance of making sure that we not only take steps at reciprocity so that you can hire someone, but so that those folks will stay. And I think that that's part of where I think is the conversation needs to move, at least at some point. And part of what I read in the report is we don't want to negatively impact our state's educator pipeline by what we continue to do with a lack of reciprocity. And so, to my point earlier, we do have a state pipeline. And Sean, I think your question about the data was really good. And so I just pulled it up, just so you know. In elementary school, the annual supply was 238, and this is from DLI data. And the demand that year was 107 new. Middle school, 245 was the annual supply, annual demand 60. So we were overproducing, and this is from the Department of Labor and Industry, not me. And so that goes on. And so irrespective of whether they're going out of state or whether they're going into other professions, we have enough completers in Montana. And so that just was something I wanted to circle back to as we consider reciprocity. How do we, is it through licensure? Is it through some other conversation? And maybe there's not a role for it in Chapter 57, but if there is any consideration we can make to supporting our completers into our schools, through Chapter 57, I would just ask that we would make it, because it doesn't seem to me like we have a pipeline issue. We have a distribution issue, and getting those teachers to your district, Sean, getting those teachers to some of our most rural and remote districts across the state. And I would just point to what John said, and there are a couple of areas where we're not graduating enough completers, and those are, in some of those content areas. So I think that that's really important for us, if we can do something in Chapter 57 to consider it. But also, if we have to take a look at these other pieces, then let's do that as well.
So partially applicable to this conversation, I just dropped a report in the chat, Angela, that you're familiar with, a couple of years ago, that looked at hard to fill positions in the state. Oversimplifying it, it said that historically hard to fill positions are hard to fill in Montana, some of the math and sciences, special education, but that the largest majority of teachers return to their positions in Montana each year. And it is more difficult to fill positions in the more rural areas than the more urban areas.
Thanks for that. That's another good piece of Eric and his team's work, and that was certainly done in partnership with the Office of Public Instruction and with our office. So a lot of good insight to glean from that.
So from this conversation, I take away a couple leverage decision points for the group, one of which is if we're thinking about reciprocity, what are we trying to accomplish? And the gist is around, do we simply need to bring in more teachers from other states? Do we need to make that easier for them, or is there something that is blocking specifically that helps? While at the same time balancing the data that shows that there are many teachers who are prepared in Montana to fill the positions. And what we don't know specifically is the extent that the current arms are a roadblock. I think we have anecdotal data on that information for out-of-state teachers, and how many potentially that it does deter or are rejected each year from out of state within that. So, Eric, you have your hand up?
Yeah, just really quick, and I think it might help just to be clear on terms, because the word itself, reciprocity, may mean different things to different people. You know, it's sort of like a continuum from once you, in some of those prior agreements with those three other states, were cases where Montana said, basically, if you're licensed in one state, you're almost automatically licensed here in Montana. Whereas it also has another meaning, which I think this group maybe is, so maybe full reciprocity would be a term to describe that. And that would be distinguished from some of these other changes, which are really more about reducing friction in the system so that out-of-state applicants, not that they're just automatically approved, but that there are no unusually restrictive or cumbersome barriers to someone with the interest and the experience and the skills to teach from being able to do that in Montana. And as you're looking at those adjustments, you can also ask the same questions of in-state applicants as well. So is there something about the licensure process even for someone from Montana who wants to stay in Montana? Is licensure in some way providing some friction to getting them from doing what they want to do? So just being clear about terms. So I would submit maybe full reciprocity be used. And it seems like it's not likely this task force is going to recommend that, but I could be proven wrong over time. And that's sort of the full automatic reciprocity, which I think the superintendent maybe has the authority to negotiate. But what we're more likely to be talking about is a lesser version of reciprocity, where we're just talking more about adjustments that reduce friction in the licensure system. So maybe we kind of all were understanding that already, but just as you're having conversation with other folks, you know, they might hear that word and think a range of what that might mean. I wouldn't be a good academic if I didn't ask us to be clear on our definitions.
Sharon?
I agree that the being clear on the definitions is really important, and perhaps even staying away from the word reciprocity entirely is important. Rather drilling down to the individual items, just like that bucket list that you have, I think on a subsequent slide here will allow each, committee member to look at the items that seem to be barriers to a smoother pathway, perhaps. But to my knowledge, the superintendent does not have the authority to determine full reciprocity. That in fact actually has to go before CISPAC and then before the Board of Public Ed. But I do like the looks of your big bucket subcommittees, because those are actually help us drill down on that reciprocity report and address each item specifically.
And I think, appreciate you bringing it up, Eric. I have a sense that these buckets also would be highly applicable to, in many cases, to in-state licensure paths as well. It could have some overlap, excluding the advanced credentials and military spouses, of course. So any thoughts before we talk about kind of moving into our next steps and try to get organized? As everyone knows, we do not have a meeting next week, but we wanted to send everybody off in some smaller groups with one of these topics for you to think about and ask yourself, if we're thinking about coursework, and I'm going to use coursework as the example, but I think we can think about coursework in terms of looking at our arms for out-of-state licensure, and we could potentially keep our minds open to also look at what would be in there around in-state licensure. And what do we see that we think are advantages? Where do we see there's some spots where we would like to potentially make adjustments? And then within whatever subgroup you were in, think about notes specifically of what you would like to discuss in this larger group. Is anybody opposed to having that format as we move forward? Again, sort of, we're going to try to assign everybody to one of these topics and let you focus in on that, knowing that we will address them one by one within this group as a whole. Okay. With that, then we'll work to try and divvy everybody up. Crystal and Tristan, is there any way we could display this on the screen where you could type into it and we could just put names under there as we went through there to try and list everybody off? We could just type in the pros section, probably would be fine. We can probably make that adjustment in our mind of what we're looking at as we put names in there. Okay, so to do this, we'll begin by asking for volunteers. We would like to assign everybody to a group. Tristan, if you would help me make sure we get everybody on the list, and Crystal, if you'll type the names in. The best way to do it, I think, is we'll just look at coursework. If that's an area you'd like to spend some time thinking about, again, knowing you only get to be in one group, you will get to have input in the larger group, but for this purpose, you only get to kind of be assigned to one for specificity and thinking while we're gone. Anybody who's in, if you're interested, give me the hand up sign, or you can just send it in the chat. And Crystal, Sean, ask if you can make the screen a little bigger. I'm not sure, Sean, if that's possible 100%, but.
I was trying to do that, but I don't know, since I can't have it in present view and type in it.
Yeah, sorry about the
do this? Hold on, let me, if you want to just keep talking a second, what I'll do, give me 1 second. I have an idea.
Jacob, while we're waiting, I just have a quick question. Is the alternate pathways section, does that include like National Board Certified Teachers?
The National Board we have thought about it now sort of under the advanced credential
Okay.
heading.
Is that better?
It's bigger on my end.
Okay, this is actually the Google Doc that I had together for where we'll put in our notes that I saw that people are having a hard time accessing. So I'll make sure that that will be on our Google site and that everyone will have access to it. Tristan and I will work on that together.
Good.
So we're
Thank
going to move through this quickly. So Crystal, we have 2 volunteers.
Okay, and if you could say the names, I can't because I only have the one screen. I don't see the chat. So if you could just say them, Jacob, that'd be
Yes.
great.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Going to read them out to you. So we actually have 2 for assessment who have already volunteered. Mike Perry and Christine Egger. If I mispronounce your name, please speak up and speak out loud. I'm going to go back to coursework. Is anybody who would like to volunteer for coursework specifically? Not everybody at once.
Well,
Got
hearing none,
Sean Scott
put mine
for
on there.
coursework.
Sharon Carroll.
Sean and Sharon.
Mhm.
Okay. Crystal Diane is interested in the advanced credentials, as is McCall. And Sue. We seem to be moving along, people volunteering for what they would like to do. So if you just want to put that in the chat, anybody, if you have an area you'd like to volunteer for, go ahead. And Valerie for the military spouses. Nick for assessment. Jewel for coursework. Heather would like to do experience. Heather, that was on your list. Phil.
We have
for
16 people. I'm sorry, go ahead, Jacob.
Phil for military spouses. Anybody for alternate pathways endorsements who'd like to? So Dean for alternate pathways. Anybody we haven't assigned yet? Angela would like to help Dean out with alternate pathways. And John for there as well. Yep, John.
That's everyone.
All right. And we'll leave endorsements for later. Great. Okay, so these are our buckets. So this is your topic. We're looking at the chapter, you can look at the chapter as a whole, thinking about, our focus that got us here was sort of out-of-state teachers coming in for licensing. But I really take away from our conversation, first thing, that we don't want to limit ourselves if it's not necessary. So if you're looking at the chapter as a whole, thinking about out-of-state teachers, but you also see things in other arms that are relevant, don't hesitate to think about that as well. What we will ask of you when you come back next week, we're going to start and just work our way across this table. So we'll start with coursework. And We're not coming back next week, so don't listen to what I said. We're coming back in 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks, the first conversation will be around coursework. So Sean, Sharon, and Jewel, you can bring back to us whatever you would like, really. You can bring back to us broad ideas. We think there are opportunities for adjustments here, here, and here. If you get into your work and you think the best thing to do is say, we think that these specific arms need to be adjusted in these ways, we can look at that as well. And that's for all of the groups. We will work within the task force with what you bring to us to work with. Meaning, again, you can sort of bring your broad topic conversations, depending upon where you get. If you find it useful and think it's best for the group to look at some specific language revisions, bring that to us as well. And we can make adjustments as we go through. But we do not intend to limit your conversation or in any way by saying you have to bring us specifics recommendations, because it may be that your conversation doesn't get you there. Yes, John, do you have any specific questions about that? I don't have enough context to speak to it right now. The interstate agreement through NASDAQ.
Yeah, so NASDAQ is the national organization of all the people in Crystal's position from around the country. And for many years, NASDAQ has had an agreement, and I believe Montana signed onto that agreement that basically says if you're licensed in another state, you can come in and work in Montana on a provisional license while you meet outstanding requirements. So while it doesn't address these great buckets we're going to be speaking about, it does talk about the fact that people should be able to come in and get going. So when we hear stories that people say, well, I couldn't get anything, I'm curious why we aren't implementing this agreement to allow people to come and work. I'm not saying that what we have them do is the right thing to have them do, but I'm trying to understand, do we actually allow them to come in and get a license under this interstate agreement?
Crystal, is that something that we want to take a look at a little bit deeper and come back with some information on?
Yes, sorry, I was writing notes and not responding, but I think that's something that I could look into, get some history on it and talk to the specialists and get back to us in 2 weeks when we meet.
Okay, we're 3 minutes till. Any closing thoughts before we break for the group? We have thoughts, yes. Sharon, go ahead, and then Tristan will come to you.
Thank you for asking that question about that NASDAQ group. Crystal, I think that there's lots of folks who have a misunderstanding about what that means. And I know that from my previous Board of Public Ed experience, it was really the licensure official in each state who had the ability to talk to each other about licensure status, whether or not there had been some sort of action on a person's licensure. That's my experience with the Board of Public Ed on that item. I was unaware that there may have been some other sort of agreement with that group. So that would be very interesting to learn.
And Sharon, I am in the same understanding as you currently.
Okay.
So what I understand of it and what I have used it for is exactly what you said. So that's why when Dawn was talking, I was taking notes with question marks to say, hey, is there something I'm missing in NASDAQ? So I will look into it. I will also talk to Julie Mergel and I will get back to the group. Thank you.
Yeah.
So John shared a link. Tristan, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to let everyone know that I was able to get my hands on the OCHI report and recommendations. So I will share that with everyone as soon as we're done here.
And Dean, we would need everybody's permission to share emails. So that is something, Tristan, if you could send out an email, BCC the group, and just ask it if anybody didn't want to share their email, that you respond, that they respond with a no, essentially. And so once Tristan can see if anybody says no, then Tristan, could we send out a email list?
Yes, I can get that done as well.
There's some people granting permission in the. And then I guess we could actually do it right now. If anybody was opposed to sharing their email address, maybe you could just send Tristan a private chat now too, and that would save her a step. And then if you say no, we will exclude you from the list. But Tristan, it seems safe that if no one does not grant permission, if they do say, if no one says no, or if they don't say no, then we can put together a list of the willing and share that for sure. So
are all of our committee members present today? Or yeah, the task force members?
No, they are not.
Okay.
We're missing 11.
All right. I will send an email to those individuals then.
I can help you with that, Tristan, when we can look at the list together. And I just pulled up the calendar. We've said it several times, just a reminder that next week we do not have a session. Lots of us will be busy with the Board of Public Ed, but that'll give you an extra week to work on your big bucket area. Any questions for Jacob, myself, or Tristan, please don't hesitate. And we will see you on July 22nd.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your week and weekend.
Yes, thank you very much.